So there I was, about to make a video about some of the more advanced wall fixings and wall anchors and plugs that are available on the market these days, and then I realised, you know, I haven't given you some of the most basic tips of how to get the most out of your humble, bog standard yellow, red and brown plastic wall plugs. Welcome back to the Gosforth Handyman Tips Library. So before I start, I'm just going to be talking about yellow, red and brown wall plugs. In the UK they get called wall plugs. I know in America you call them anchors or something weird like that. But these are generally only for use in solid walls. And I'm going to be showing you stuff today into a concrete block. It's a 7.3 Newton concrete block. I'm not going to be talking about hollow walls, plasterboard, drywall, anything like that. Not in today's video. I'm also not going to be talking about thermalite or any of your kind of lightweight aerated concrete blocks. They're a whole different ball game. You can have a bash at using these in thermalite if you want, but we'll come back to that. That's a bit of a different thing. These particular ones I'm showing you here are all made by Fischer. This isn't sponsored by Fischer. So we've got here your 5mm yellow plugs, 6mm red plugs and 8mm brown plugs. I am well aware that you can get brown plugs that are also in 7mm, not these ones. These are 8mm. They've got a number 8 written on them. Drill bit wise with something like this, you're generally going to be using a 6mm masonry bit for the red plugs, an 8mm masonry bit for the brown plugs, or a 5mm masonry bit for the yellow plugs. If you're going to be using an SDS drill, and I'll make a different video about that at some point, I would generally go 0.5mm down, because the vibration of the SDS drill can just cause the hole to be slightly bigger than needed. And worst case, you can always do the hole 0.5mm smaller and then come to it with a combi drill with the correct size hole. And it's better to do that than to use like a 6mm SDS bit and find that you've made the hole a bit too big. Very, very rare that I would be using an SDS for a yellow plug, and to be honest, it's very rare that I use the brown plugs anyway. We'll come back to that. In terms of screw sizes, always go by the manufacturer's data sheet. These ones, Fischer recommend a 3 to 4mm screw for the yellow plugs, a 4 to 5mm screw for the red plugs, and a 4.5 to 6mm screw for your brown plugs. Now, if you've not already seen some of my Test Tuesday videos, we've already proven that the red plug can handle colossal weights in concrete. Way, way more than you're ever likely to need. And that's why, generally speaking, brown plugs, in my view, are a little bit pointless. But if for some reason you need to use a 6mm screw as opposed to a 5mm screw, a 6mm screw would probably rip the red plugs to shreds a little bit too much. So if for some reason you're doing a project where you've got to use a 6mm screw, then go for the brown plug instead. So just for the minute, I'm going to dismiss the yellow plugs and the brown plugs and just have a little chat about the red plugs, because this is the one that you're going to be using almost all the time. Screw wise, I like to go for either a 10 gauge screw if you're working off imperial measurements, or a 5mm screw if you're working off metric. But we'll come back to some of these longer screws and what you can do with them. Now, these are just bog standard wood screws. These are silver screws with a single thread, and these are quicksilver screws with a twin thread. Now, I've found negligible difference between these in terms of the holding power into a red plug. All I would say, and I've mentioned this before, is avoid screws that have a very aggressive thread on them. For example, these are turbo gold screws, and you can see they've got the self-drilling ultra sharp tip on them, and they've got the rifled shank and all sorts of other little things that are designed for helping the screw to cut its way into wood but it doesn't really help matters when you're going into plastic wall plugs, and it tends to damage the plug. If you've got no other option, they will work, but you'll probably get better holding power from bog standard single or twin thread wood screws. Obviously, the other key difference here between the silver screw and the Quicksilver is that on the silver screw, we've got the thread going all the way up to the head, the countersunk head of the screw, and on the Quicksilver, the thread stops about 10 mil shy of the head of the screw, and that's really useful if you're attaching, say for example, timber battening or something like that. If you're attaching stuff onto the wall and you don't want that bit of whatever you're attaching to be disturbed by the thread of the screw, then this kind of thread pattern is probably going to be a better option for you. So first of all, let's cover the absolute basics of using a 40mm screw in a red plug. All you're going to do, normally a combi drill will be fine for something like this, but it depends how solid your concrete wall is or your concrete blocks. Hammer action on, and I'm going to go in the depth of the screw plus a little bit. I want it so that the tip of the screw has no chance of bottoming out in the hole. Here's a really common thing that can happen. Did you see how the bit moved while I'm drilling into the piece? That can happen very easily if you hit like a dense little stone in the concrete or whatever. So all I'm going to do, I'm going to drill in at a slight angle. And then I'm going to bring the drill back up to vertical again. And then that should get me back on path. Hopefully, you'll know once you get the plug in whether or not you're still getting a decent fixing. But hopefully that at least gets your hole back in the correct position. You can put a mark on the drill bit if you want, but just check with your screw that it's not hitting the bottom of the hole, which it's not. Absolutely fine there. Just going to give the hole a quick blow. If that was on a wall, the dust would have fallen down by gravity into my patent dust catcher, which I've already made a video all about. Pop the plug in. Doesn't matter if it goes slightly below the surface. We'll chat a little bit about what happens when you're on a wall with really thick plaster. Obviously, you would be attaching something onto the wall, but I'm just showing you it bare. Impact driver is generally really good for this sort of job. And that's it. Absolutely solid fixing. That will never in a million years come out. As I say, we've already done tests on this channel showing the crazy sort of weights that you can get off a single screw into a red plug in concrete. Now what happens if you've really made a mess of this hole? So let me just try and get this plug out. So let's say that, okay, you've ended up moving the drill all over the shop to try and get it straight, and you've made the hole too big. So now the red plug's just generally flopping about a little bit in the hole. A little tip for you here, and you can take a yellow plug, tap it into the red plug, get it in as far as it'll go comfortably, get some snips, trim it off, and then we're back to getting a really strong fitting again, even though the hole's a little bit oversized. By the way, this is a bit of a one-shot thing, because as soon as you take the screw out, because you've chopped the end of your yellow plug off, there's nothing really holding these arms. But you can see where the thread has quite happily bit into the yellow plug and then forced the red plug to have a nice secure fitting in the hole. And of course, if you really muck it up and you're still struggling to get a good fixing with a red plug, then upgrade to a brown plug, switch over to an 8mm bit, drill it out for the 8mm. Obviously, just make sure that you drill the hole deep enough for your brown plug, because these are a little bit bigger. Again, slightly below the surface. You can use the same screw, it'll be fine. You can go for a 6mm if you want, but you can use a 5mm screw with brown, it'll be fine. But as we've proven in previous tests, a red plug with a 5mm screw will give a stronger fixing than a brown plug with a 5mm screw. So just bear that in mind. And of course, if you're still having problems getting a good fixing into your brown plug, then you can do the same again. Let's say you've completely mucked up your 8mm hole. And you've made it far too big. Same thing, brown plug, pop a red plug into the brown plug, tap it home. And we're back to getting a crazily secure fixing. Now obviously, generally speaking, you're going to want to drill a fresh hole rather than going for these kind of remedial fixes, but you do run into situations where that's just not an option. If you've got a bracket that you're putting on the wall and that is literally the only place you can put the hole, and you've mucked the hole up, or what is much more common that you're going to run into, you know, if you've got a perfect concrete block like this, everything's generally going to be fine. Problems start to occur when you hit the edge of a block and you go into a mortar line, and especially in older houses, that mortar line can sometimes be like just going into dust. It can be like going into just sand. But if you still feel that you're not getting a good fixing by putting one plug inside another, and of course you can also do a yellow plug inside a brown plug as well, which can work pretty well. But if you're still not confident that you're getting a good fixing, then just go deeper into whatever you're drilling into. So this is where having a selection of longer screws can really help the situation. A few different scenarios here. First of all, you might have done your hole and you're just not confident that you're getting a good fixing with a 40mm screw. I'm going to switch to Imperial here because I've got a few different screw sizes. So let's say you didn't get a very good fixing with your 2.5-inch screw. Well, one thing you can do is just go deeper into whatever you're drilling into. The first thing I'm going to do is try a 2.5-inch screw instead of the 1 3/4 inch. So basically this screw. So you can see straight away that's going to bottom out in the hole. That's no use. That's comfortably reaching the bottom of the hole. And in that sort of situation, just run 2 reds back to back. Now just double check that if you do run 2 back to back, are they likely to bottom out? It doesn't matter if they do, so you can always trim the top off, but take your first red plug, pop it in, get a long screw, any long screw, hammer it all the way down to the bottom of the hole, just gently, and then get your second plug, and now we've got a 2.5-inch screw. And likewise, this hole here that we had the 8mm plug in, let's go for a 3-inch screw into that instead. Just going to drill the hole a bit deeper with the 8mm masonry bit. As I say, just make sure the tip of the screw isn't hitting the bottom of the hole. Well done, Andrew. Again, let's see if we can get 2 brown plugs back to back. Not quite. So what I'm going to do in this situation, I don't want to trim off the top of the plug in this situation if possible, because that's what's holding the plug together. So what I'd rather do is just trim a bit off the first plug that's going to go in. Hammer that home. Second plug in. That ain't going anywhere. So just to quickly summarise where we are so far. Red plug should be absolutely fine in the vast majority of situations. If you want to use a bigger screw, just run them back to back. You can go out and buy longer plugs if you want, and there's all sorts of other options, but you know, there's only so much stuff that you can carry around on a job. Generally speaking, running your plugs back to back will be fine. If you've made the hole too big, consider going for a brown plug, or run your brown plugs back to back as well if you want to go for a bigger screw. If you're still not confident that you're getting a good fixing using all of these kind of methods that I've talked about here, let me just pop a pound coin on here so you can get an idea of the scale of what we're talking about. But you could go for things like your big frame fixings. I mean, these have a specific purpose that I'll talk about on a separate video. But again, if you happen to have these in your toolkit, they can be handy to get you out of a number of different situations. We've already talked about the Fischer DuoPower plugs. These are fantastic. The only thing is you might struggle running them back to back, because if you can see, there's a little lip on the back end of the plug. Next on the list is maybe to go for a bigger Fischer DuoPower. This is the DuoPower 10x50 plug. These particular ones, great for TV brackets and stuff like that. 10mm hole for the plug itself, and they come with 7x70 coach screws. You could also look into using something like the Fischer UX plugs. Again, that's the UX10, so 10mm hole on these particular ones. They're a great problem solver to have in your kit bag. And have a look into just using concrete screws, no plug whatsoever. These have like a self-cutting thread on them. You can see the serrations on the red part of the thread there. And finally, my last port of call would be to bring in the wall bolt. If you're still struggling with all of these to get a good fixing, get a wall bolt or shield anchor onto the job. And I've yet to run into a situation where one of these doesn't fix the problem that I'm trying to have with attaching something crazily heavy onto a wall. Remember, on most walls, and we're not talking about dot and dab here, on most walls you're going to have plaster over the top of your either block work or brick or whatever, and you need to get past that plaster. The plaster gives you nigh on no holding power whatsoever, so you need to get into the solid block work. If you do hit a mortar line, you're going to have to be a little bit more creative on the fixing that you're using. It really depends on what you're trying to hang on the wall. Wall bolts can actually work pretty well in a mortar line because it's wide enough that it's going to bridge that gap between the two layers of brick or the two layers of block. So these can get you out of a lot of tricky situations, but obviously you're then a little bit more limited in the sort of fitting that you can actually use with a wall bolt because of the thickness of the actual bolt itself. But generally speaking, your humble red plug is going to be fine for the vast majority of situations. As I say, I'm generally using the DuoPower plug these days, but I still carry these around. I carry red plugs, brown plugs, and even the little yellow plugs, because you never know when you might have to do a little bit of remedial work just to get the fitting working the way that you want it. I'll be going into these slightly more exotic fittings in future videos, so don't forget to hit subscribe if you're new to the channel. We're going to be talking about thermalite blocks and dot and dab in a separate video because they're a whole different animal. Remember, always check the manufacturer's data sheets for the maximum loadings that you can use with a particular fixing. I'll try and pop links in the description below to all of the fixings that we've talked about today. I hope you found that useful. I shall see you next time. Tatty bye.